Okay, so remember, think about why these women are always recognized in our history books. Okay, at the beginning there's a timeline. I'm going to leave this book where you can look at it, okay? So there's a little timeline talking about different things women did from this story, okay? Okay, the first lady we're talking about, Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Eliza Lucas was only 16 years old when her father went off to fight for England against Spain and left her in charge of 3 plantations in South Carolina. On the plantations, or big farms, slaves did most of the work planting and harvesting rice. Eliza thought it was silly just to grow rice and nothing else. She thought her plantation should grow indigo, a plant used for making blue dye. Many of the soldiers' uniforms in Europe were blue, so the armies needed indigo, and Eliza was convinced she could make it grow. All of the experienced farmers laughed at her and told her she could never make it work, but they were wrong. After several years of trying and failing, she finally succeeded, and indigo became the biggest money-making crop in South Carolina before the American Revolution. What's the American Revolution?
The Revolutionary War.
It was a Revolutionary War. It's when America fought for their freedom from England. Okay.
It's on the same page, so you don't have to go back.
Where was that? Here we go. And a 19-year-old girl had made that happen. Eliza married Charles Pinckney, another plantation owner, and they soon had 3 children. When the Revolutionary War broke out, the Pinckneys were staunch American patriots. That means they supported the American side, not the English side. Both of Eliza's sons were taken prisoner by the British, and after they were released, they fought with General George Washington. The British also ransacked and ruined Eliza's home and left her with no crops and no money. After the war, she lived at her daughter Harriet's plantation and helped run it. Our first president, who's our first president? George Washington traveled to South Carolina while he was in office. There, he made a special trip to see Eliza Pinckney and her daughter Harriet. And when Eliza died, Washington insisted on honoring her at her funeral for the service she had given to the country. Eliza was always thinking up ideas for making money on her plantations, what she called her little schemes. What's a scheme? A scheme's kind of like a plan. She came up with a plan for indigo, didn't she? For growing indigo. She cultivated figs to dry and sell, and she planted oak trees, certain that one day the colonies would need wood for ships. She was thinking ahead, wasn't she? She raised silkworms and put the women and girls to work making silk. Her family has saved one of the silk dresses they made, and now, more than 250 years later, museums around the country put it on display. So there's still a silk dress that's still around over 200 years later that you can look at. That would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Even though she was very young, Eliza had been well educated in England. She set up a school for the slaves on her plantations and taught her little sister as well. She even acted as a lawyer for some of the local people, writing wills for them. And she kept studying herself, reading every book in English or French that she could find. She sounds pretty cool, doesn't she? Let's see what we're reading about next. Deborah Reed Franklin. Who do you think she is?
Ben Franklin's wife.
Ben Franklin's wife. Let's see. Though Deborah Reed and Benjamin Franklin met in Philadelphia when they were teenagers, Ben soon went off to England. Years later, they got back together, and Deborah's mother let Ben open a printing shop in the back of her own variety store. Deborah worked in both shops, quickly becoming an accomplished businesswoman. Ben started writing a newspaper and experimenting with inventions and grew so well known that he was called to public service. Deborah worked to expand the printing enterprise into a series of shops along what was then the frontier, western Pennsylvania. Is that what y'all thought of when y'all heard the word frontier?
Yeah, no.
Pennsylvania? No. I would have thought like the Great Plains, right? Kind of like it was in the 1800s, but this is in the 1700s. Okay? And when Ben accepted the title of postmaster, it was Deborah who ran the postal service. So did he do much for her after he started it? No, she helped him, didn't she? She had to take charge because Ben was out of the country for years at a time. Can you imagine girls being married to someone and not seeing them for years? That would be hard, wouldn't it? He represented the Pennsylvania colony in England and thought it important for him to stay there to argue against laws like the Stamp Act that the Americans thought were unfair. Deborah was left to run everything, and Ben thought she did an excellent job of managing money, saying she was a fortune to him. But she missed him and wanted him home. Though she begged him to come back, Ben didn't return to America until after Deborah died. She didn't get to see him again, did she? Many years later, he had a dream that he met his wife in heaven and tried to renew the marriage. But in the dream, Deborah wouldn't have him, telling him that she had been his wife for almost 50 years. Be content with that. So he was having a dream that she didn't want him anymore, right? Ben was in England when the hated Stamp Act became law, and his Philadelphia neighbors thought he hadn't fought hard enough against it. Furious, they decided to tear down his house. Instead of hiding, Deborah asked a couple of relatives to bring guns, and when the angry mob arrived, she scared away the crowd. So she saved their house, didn't she? They got mad.
Well, the people so little.
It's just illustrations. I'm not sure. When Ben heard the story, he praised her spirit and courage, but he still didn't come home like Deborah wanted him to. After Ben was named first Postmaster General for the colonies, Deborah was left to make sure the mail was delivered. When Lord London, the Englishman in charge of the Postal Service, tried to fire one of her workers, Deborah stood up to him, accusing his men of treating her very unpolitely and complaining that he was slowing down the mail system. So much for Lord London.
But isn't she dead?
Not yet. This was just talking about something she did after, like before she died. Yeah.
We didn't even make the day before she died.
Okay, the next one we're going to learn about is Mercy Otis Warren. At the time of the American Revolution, of course there were no radios, television, or computers. Ooh, can you imagine life without those? Yes. So politicians depended on newspapers and pamphlets to spread their messages. One of the most important writers arguing for independence from Britain was Mercy Otis Warren. It was unusual for a woman to have such a powerful voice, because women during this time were supposed to be what? Quiet, right? They were supposed to be seen and not heard. They weren't supposed to have an opinion. But Mercy was an unusual woman. Her father, brother, and husband were all prominent in Massachusetts politics, and they listened to what Mercy had to say. She enjoyed a better education than most girls of her time, studying along with her brothers until they went to college, which girls weren't allowed to do. The Patriots, men plotting to free the colonies from the British, met at Mercy Warren's home and encouraged her to write plays and poems attacking the governor of Massachusetts, who was loyal to the English king. Theater performances were against the law at the time. Can you imagine not being able to go see a play? That would be... The people who read the plays in the newspapers of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia realized the British weren't treating the Americans fairly. After fighting began in Massachusetts, Mercy wrote to the congressmen meeting in Philadelphia who were trying to decide whether to declare independence. Her letters describing how British war troops threatened Boston and how enemy soldiers destroyed churches and occupied the city shocked the Congress. What do you think she mean by shocked?
Surprise.
Surprised them. Because Americans were rebelling against their laws, the British decided to stage a surprise attack. English soldiers marched on Concord, Massachusetts, where they planned to kidnap patriots and then go to Lexington to destroy the rebels' supplies. But the Americans found out about the plan and put up a fight. The British won the battles but lost many soldiers. Mercy Warren wrote about the battles to men in Congress and helped convince them to send an army to Massachusetts. George Washington headed the American troops sent to Cambridge, Massachusetts to battle the British in Boston. Mercy went to meet him and the other generals and wrote to John Adams about it. She thought Washington was amiable and accomplished, but General Charles Lee, though she found him sensible and judicious, she also thought he was marked by ugliness and unpoliteness. That means she didn't like him. He wasn't polite, was he? You think she meant that he was actually ugly?
Right.
No. What was
What does that mean?
his words, the way he acted towards her, right? She didn't know we'd be reading her letters more than 200 years later. So some places, like some museums, probably have her letters that you can go see if you don't think. Okay, now we're going to learn about some women writers.
Read the sentence.
Though women couldn't run for office or speak before large crowds at the time of the American Revolution, they could write. They could put quilted parchment in the privacy of their homes. And several of them, like Mercy Otis Warren, wrote political poems and plays hoping to shape history. Usually they published their writings under fictitious names. Many of the men did that too. Often everyone knew who they were anyway. But during the war, when women had to take on much of the work of their absent husbands, brothers, fathers, or sons, some writers grew bolder. They started signing their own names to their works, and their writing turned to subjects like women's education, women's problems, and even women's rights. So letters. Women's private writings, letters and diaries, tell us much more about their lives than anything published for the public. Reading their mail, and in parentheses, they have, it's okay to be nosy, they've been dead for a long time. They're adding a little humor, aren't they? You learn what women were happy about and worrying about, along with everyday happenings like who was having babies and what was the latest fashion. Unfortunately, because women weren't considered important, most of their letters were destroyed. Thank goodness we have the ones we do. Remember the ladies. One of the most famous letters ever written was from Abigail to her husband John Adams. With independence from Britain, she realized America would need another form of government. In the new code of laws, Abigail advised the Congress should remember the ladies. Otherwise, she warned, we are determined to foment a rebellion. John laughed at her, but Abigail's "Remember the Ladies" has echoed through our history. Making the case against England. Women writers like Inez Bowdenat Stockton, that's her name, wrote poems that angered the public against the British. Here are a few lines of her poem, Rallying the Patriots after the Battle of Bunker Hill, where American General Joseph Warren was killed. Thousands of heroes from his dust shall rise, who still shall freedom's injured cause maintain, and show the lawless king the rights of men. So she was saying they needed to go against the King of England, right? Making the case for women. Though few Americans considered men and women as equal, some female writers bravely argued for women's rights. Best known was Judith Sargent Murray, who shocked readers with her magazine article on the equality of sexes, but also made them think about the subject. A couple of years later, when Englishwoman Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women arrived in America, everybody rushed to read it. So they were writing about women's rights, weren't they?
Reginald, bring your pencil.
America's first bestseller. It was the best-selling book in the country for decades, and it was about a woman wronged by a man. The publisher of The Sad Story of Charlotte Temple by Susanna Ralston told the author that sales exceed those of any of the most celebrated novels. And this book is still in print. You could go to the bookstore and still buy this book. And it was written in the 1700s. It's a really long time. Yes, ma'am.
It wasn't book fair. They have any book fair this year?
I don't know if I'll have it at the book fair, but you could probably go to like Books on the Main or somewhere.
What, Target?
That are on this list.
I don't know if Target has them. I don't know. Yes,
You
it
work
is.
at Target?
And then look at the next Amazon. You can go back and read each part of the story.
Okay, Phyllis Wheatley. While George Washington was camped in Cambridge, he invited a truly remarkable woman to pay him a visit. Phyllis Wheatley had been raised as a slave, but by the time she met General Washington, she was an internationally celebrated poet. No one knew how old the little girl was when she was snatched from her parents in Africa and stashed aboard the slave ship, Phyllis. But the Wheatleys guessed she was probably 7 or 8 because she still had some of her baby teeth. Susanna Wheatley, the mother of the family, brought Phyllis to help her with household chores. Soon, 18-year-old Mary Wheatley, who taught Phyllis English and Bible studies, realized how smart her student was. And by age 12, Phyllis was writing poetry and living more like a family member than a servant. Eventually, the Wheatleys freed her. When newspapers printed her poems, no one could believe that a young slave was the author. People were even more amazed when a book of her poetry was published in England. After General Washington read Phyllis's poem praising him, he wrote to her saying he wanted to meet someone so favored by the muses. It might surprise you that Phyllis Wheatley lived in Boston, since we think of slavery as Southern. But before the Revolution, slavery was legal in all of the American colonies. Many slaves suffered under harsh conditions, and few enjoyed the treatment Phyllis received. Another Massachusetts slave, Elizabeth Freeman, called Lumbet, won her freedom in a lawsuit against her owners that helped lead to the abolition of slavery in the state. Here, one of Phyllis Wheatley's poems where she wrote about slavery is the reason she so loved freedom. So this is one of her poems. Whence flow these wishes for the common good, by filling parts along best understood? I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Africa's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, that what sorrow labor in my parents' breast. So she was, what, taken from her
Parents in Africa.
Parents in Africa, yeah. She was snatched and taken to America for slavery purposes.
The African people snatched her? Why they kidnapped her? Why they...
It was just the poem. Abigail Adams, you are really brave, my dear. You are a heroine, wrote John Adams to his wife, Abigail. The man who would become our second president was then at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia while his wife and 4 children were home in Massachusetts in daily danger from the British. Abigail strongly believed in American independence, so supported her husband's political activities, but she had to keep the farm going by herself, always worrying where the British would strike next. John wrote that if it got really dangerous, she should fly to the woods with our children. Think of how alone she must have felt. Abigail, who sent John constant advice about the new government and current updates about politics, kept her letters coming when she went to Europe on diplomatic missions. Finally, after she had been gone for 6 years, she joined John in England. In the first nationwide election, John Adams won as George Washington's vice president. Abigail moved to New York, the temporary capital city, so Washington, D.C. wasn't the capital right now, and then to Philadelphia, where she assumed the job of First Lady once John was elected president. Then it was on to the brand new city of Washington and the unfinished White House, which was so cold it took fires in 13 chimneys to keep it warm.
13.
13. John lost re-election to Thomas Jefferson, and the Adams couple retired to Massachusetts. Abigail lived to see her son, John Quincy Adams, become Secretary of State, but she died before he was elected as the country's 6th president. So her son was the 6th president, and her husband was the 2nd president. So it's kind of like a family thing, right? You're president.
So 4 years after her son.
After he grew up, John Quincy Adams described the terrifying time of the Revolution in Massachusetts. For the space of 12 months, my mother with her infant children dwelt, liable every hour of the day and night to be butchered in cold blood or taken and carried to Boston as hostages. So he was afraid for their safety, wasn't he? But at the time, Abigail bravely wrote, "Danger, they say, makes people valiant," which means brave. Makes them brave. When Abigail advised John to remember the ladies, she was eager to improve the lives of American women. She was especially interested in education, feeling that too many women were deprived of decent schooling. Even though she and her sisters had been taught well by their preacher father and his students, Abigail never thought her education was good enough. After the Revolution, many women's schools were established so that educated mothers could raise sons to be good citizens. Yes.
Who was the 2nd president?
John Adams.
I don't think I was